Willkommen zurück auf Neutrality Studies.
Welcome back to Neutrality Studies. Today, for the first time, we're joined by Dr. Stefan Wachtel, one of Germany's most renowned and hands-on linguists. In addition to writing numerous non-fiction books, he also works as an executive coach, training top international leaders from business, public life, and sports. Dr. Wachtel, welcome. Thank you very much. I'm really glad you're here because you're the author of a recently published book. It's right behind you, but I'll still hold it up for a moment. Here it is, The New Orality, Rhetoric of the 21st Century.
Rhetorik des 21. Jahrhunderts. Und ich habe Ihnen schon im Vorgespräch gesagt, Sie haben da was von...
And I already mentioned to you before the interview that you took some notes from my brain speech, because it's so interesting how right now a lot of intellectual work or debate across different fields isn't happening just in writing anymore, but also in spoken form. And you described that in great detail. By the way, I just want to say, you're also the author of several other non-fiction books. I have them here: The Target Sentence Principle, Executive Mode, and The Art of Authenticity. You've been working on the topic of rhetoric for quite some time, and that's what we want to talk about today. Could you maybe start by telling me a bit about this book and how it came about?
Können Sie mir vielleicht zuerst zu diesem Buch ein bisschen erzählen, wie es dazu kam?
Yes, as other books show, I'm a mechanic, a speech mechanic, and I really enjoy that. I studied speech science, then worked with pilots, training them on their announcements. That was a lot of fun. After that, I spent 7 years training IDZF hosts, which was also quite enjoyable at the time. And for more than 20 years now, I've been coaching top executives and just a few politicians, 2 federal ministers so far. As a mechanic, I've realized it's important to know the framework you're working in. A mechanic uses levers, rods, specific methods, a toolbox. And through that, I've discovered 2 things. The first thing is this: if people want to have an impact, it's important that they're in the right mode, that they're in the right mindset. And Germans, and German-speaking Swiss as well, aren't really built for that kind of thing. They tend to be more analytical, a bit factual, objective, a bit gray. The French speak well, the English speak well, the French dress well, the Italians love to eat, and the Germans are more gray and a bit boring. They're just not made for it. That's why rhetoric and rhetorical training are especially important in German-speaking culture. But people have to get into the right mindset, and that's why I came up with the idea of the executive mode, a metaphor for getting into the right frame of mind. And that's especially important in German-speaking culture, where Germans and Swiss Germans, well, they're not exactly made for rhetoric. The French dress well, the Italians eat well, the English speak well, but the Germans, not so much. That's why it really matters. And as a mechanic, I noticed something. All of that is great, it's fun, but people need to get into the right mindset if they want to have an impact. That's why I came up with something I call executive mode. It's kind of like a brainwash, how to get people into a better mental movie, so to speak, said with a bit of humor. And there's one more thing that's important. In what kind of setting do people actually practice their craft? For the past 10 years, we've seen a global trend that I like to call neurality, or the new orality. People are talking more and writing less. They're listening more and reading less. As you said, we live in a world where ideas are increasingly shared through spoken words. And you're one of the key figures in this new orality, along with all the podcasters out there. It's a development that probably won't fade anytime soon. There are a few counter-trends, we can talk about those too, and a few specific signs that show how this shift is taking shape.
Let's talk about these phenomena for a moment. You're absolutely right, of course, and you describe them in your book as well. How, over the past 20 years, the internet has become more and more auditory, first focused on sound and then increasingly on video, and how that's led to this situation we have now, where we communicate with each other while third parties are listening and watching.
Dritten, die uns zuhören und zusehen?
Ein Grund ist natürlich Technologie. Das war
One
schon
reason, of
so
course,
in
is
der
technology.
frühen Mündlichkeit.
That was already the case in the earlier era of orality we had a few decades ago, shaped by radio and television. So yes, one reason is technology, and another reason is the rhetorical possibilities we have today. There's a renaissance of rhetoric. That's the second reason, a renaissance of rhetoric. Rhetoric is becoming increasingly important, even in the kinds of contexts I've described, including those within German-speaking culture.
Kulturlichen Kontexten immer wichtiger.
Ja, und diese Wichtigkeit,
Yes,
an was machen,
and this
das
importance, what do you base
festigen
that on?
und
I mean, in your book, you describe how consumption, even of reading, is actually declining right now, right? And a lot of people say, well, that's because people are getting lazy about thinking. But that's not really it, is it? It's more of a shift, right? It's about the way people take in information and how their thoughts interact with others.
Aufnehmen und Gedanken anderer mit anderen interagieren.
Ja, Technologie, hatte ich ja gesagt, zum einen, und es ist Social Media.
Yes, technology, as I mentioned earlier, plays a big role, and that includes social media. These platforms and apps make it easier and easier to share spoken content and to communicate verbally. That has a number of effects. One of them is that even when we write, we tend to use more spoken language. Short messages, emails, there are even dissertations on this. It's clear that writing is becoming more oral. And of course, that influence goes both ways. Writing also pushes back, so we see spoken language taking on more written features again. But the overall trend is clearly moving towards speaking and listening. There's one phenomenon I like to joke about a little, though I'm part of it myself, and in a way, so are you, and that's the speaker.
Sie in gewisser Weise ja auch, das ist der Speaker. Ja? Wenn Sie LinkedIn aufschlagen, wer irgendwie
When you
irgendwo
open
mal
LinkedIn,
auf einer
you
Bühne
see it
steht,
everywhere.
ich mach das
Anyone
auch.
who's ever stood on a stage somewhere posts their picture, looking all serious and important. That's the speaker phenomenon. Back in the 80s, it was the dentist who had status. In the 90s, it was the heart surgeon. Then it was the manager, but that's out now. Today, it's the speaker. So if you're a speaker, you've made it. There was a real boost for this new kind of orality, not just for speakers, but really for everyone. That was during the pandemic, which changed everything. It was also when what you and I are doing right now really took off. Suddenly, we couldn't be close to each other anymore, weren't allowed to, couldn't experience closeness, and people longed for it. And then all of a sudden, we found ways to create that closeness through technology.
Das hat man die Nähe technisch herstellen können plötzlich. Das war der Aufstieg der Zoom Corporation ins Unermessliche.
That was the rise of Zoom Corporation into the stratosphere. The stock price just exploded. And during that time, more and more conversations started happening remotely. That had some consequences. People could talk even more. Every other person decided to start a podcast. And there was another outcome, the exact opposite of what we expected. We thought, okay, the stage is dead. From now on, we'll only talk remotely. The event industry is finished. I had even predicted the death of the event industry. But that didn't happen. The event industry came back to life. Everything's now at an even higher quality. Ticket prices have gone up, and today there's more and more talking, both remotely and on stage. So both the stage and the real.
Immer mehr geredet. Also Bühne und Real beides.
Und wenn Sie
And you call that the new orality. Can you tell us what the earlier forms of orality were? So radio, television, and before that. You also describe a kind of back and forth trend between spoken and written culture. Somehow, every few decades, we seem to move forward and then back again.
Jahrzehnte vor und zurück.
Ja, also ich bin kein Historiker, ich habe mir so eine
Well, I'm not a historian. In the book, I allowed myself to take a look at this back and forth between written and spoken culture. We started with the first original form of orality, where everything happened through storytelling, through practical communication. Human history was at first entirely oral. Writing came later. That was what I call M1. Then came S1, the first stage of writing, cuneiform. After that, there was a second major phase of orality, in antiquity, when rhetoric played a central role. Democracy and rhetoric are, as we know, very closely connected. We can come back to that later. That period lasted all the way into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance.
bis ins Mittelalter, bis in die Renaissance. Und dann hat die Schriftlichkeit wieder zurückgeschlagen.
And then, writing struck back again in Mainz. I'm here in Frankfurt, just around the corner from Mainz. Peter Schoeffer, with his machine, and Johannes Gutenberg. And suddenly they had established something that said, everything important has to be written down. That lasted for a very, very long time, almost until Hitler, you could say, if you want to put it sharply. And then, spoken language struck back again. There was the second-to-last phase of orality, brought on by radio and television, voices carried through the airwaves, and then suddenly images were transmitted through the air as well. And of course, that was tremendous. It gave spoken communication a huge boost.
Großartig, es war ein Riesenturbo für die Mündlichkeit. Für den Journalismus hatte das schon Konsequenzen.
That had real consequences for journalism. Suddenly, it wasn't just the writer who mattered most anymore, but also the person who showed their face. Charismatic figures started to emerge. We all still remember them. Peter Scholl-Latour, and those personalities who came to us through television. They weren't just delivering texts anymore. They had a voice. Then, the written word struck back. Technology arrived, the World Wide Web appeared, and this new kind of online writing took shape. And that, in a way, had already been foreshadowed by Hewlett and Packard. Hewlett and Packard were, so to speak, the patron saints of this last era of writing.
Letzten Schriftlichkeit, jeder Haushalt ein Drucker, hieß es.
Every household had a printer, they said. Everyone was looking at everything. Dissertations were uploaded online, texts were shared, people were writing and posting nonstop. So the same technology that made all that possible suddenly brought back this new kind of orality. Suddenly, thanks to technology, and as I said, there were two main reasons. Technology, and the second one, the pandemic. The pandemic acted like a turbo boost for remote video communication, for remote audio communication. And now we're in this phase where all of that is unfolding. And that has a few consequences.
Das hat ein paar Konsequenzen. Eine Konsequenz ist natürlich gut für mich, solche für mich.
One consequence is, of course, good for me, people like me. Folks like me make a living from having rhetorical skills and continuing to professionalize them. That means it's not just about quantity, it's also about quality. Nobody wants to listen to meaningless talk anymore. You really have to pull yourself together. You need a solid plan. You need strong speech structures. I've developed a few methods for that myself, like the target sentence principle. And there's no end in sight. It's like the second law of thermodynamics. Once something's in motion, it's not so easy to stop. Unfortunately, just like the political issues you're dealing with.
Politischen Themen, mit denen Sie sich da beschäftigen.
Ja, und
Yeah, and there's this interesting phenomenon happening right now. It's about orality and literacy. The two are really intertwined. At the moment, a lot of people are saying, sure, these podcasts are great, but I just don't have the time. And now many podcasters are starting to use AI to turn their spoken content back into written form, to condense it and then send it out. So we're seeing this back and forth again. What's your sense of how AI might transform this new kind of orality?
wieder irgendwie umwälzen wird.
Möglicherweise erstens das, was Sie beschrieben haben.
Possibly. First of all, what you just described. Technology now makes it possible to take something written and turn it into spoken language. You can even search within spoken content. That wasn't possible before. You can look for a keyword. You can turn speech back into text. That's one of the counter-developments we're seeing in response to this new ability to make spoken language available as written text. But the strengths of spoken communication remain. They're still so dominant, so powerful, that writing really can't compete with them. Creating a sense of closeness, as I mentioned earlier, building a feeling of togetherness, and projecting a kind of apparent authenticity.
Scheinbare Authentizität, das ist ein ganz schwieriges Thema. Ich habe auch dazu ein Buch geschrieben.
That's a tough topic. I actually wrote a book about it called The Art of Being Authentic. How authentic do you really have to be? There's this idea of seeming authenticity, of intensity. I mean, right now, both of us can use gestures. You do that in your podcast too, to emphasize something. We can push our thoughts out more forcefully through physical expression. All of that gives us an advantage that writing, no matter how much you use AI to generate text, simply can't match. And there's another thing. Since we're talking about counter movements, there's also a second one, the renaissance of the book. A small counter movement, but still. I love books. That's not a standard of measure, of course, but I really do love them.
Kein Maßstab, aber ich liebe Bücher. Ich liebe diese Lust.
I love that urge, that almost masochistic pleasure of fine-tuning texts. Speaking doesn't come as easily, and there's a kind of renaissance of the book. People want, in some way, to present something written again. There's also a third counter trend. A lot of people don't want to listen to voice messages anymore. They say, I'm not listening to all that. Please, no voice messages. I only read what's written. Those are a few counter movements. But compared to the global trend, and it really is global, I was just in Singapore with a colleague. We talked about it, even held a workshop on it. Worldwide, it's pretty minor, almost negligible.
Banal oder eher zu vernachlässigen.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And it's not an either-or situation. It's really both. In the end, we're talking about two forms of communication that constantly influence each other, push each other forward, and keep changing in the process. But at the core of all this, and you write about this as well, lies rhetoric. So, what exactly is rhetoric, and how does it differ between spoken and written language? I'm not even sure you can really talk about written rhetoric, but how important is the idea of rhetoric when it comes to understanding this new kind of orality?
Yes, those are two terms that always sit a bit awkwardly together. You mentioned it yourself. Is there actually such a thing as written rhetoric? Well, yes. The major academic chair in Germany, in Tübingen, Walter Jens was the key figure there, has always viewed rhetoric primarily as written rhetoric, as the art of formulation. And that really does exist. Rhetoric as the art of crafting language. It has its legitimacy, historically, of course, and especially in the German context, where for centuries, rhetoric, freedom of speech, and democracy weren't really part of public life. In that setting, written rhetoric, this fine chiseling of texts, was naturally held in very high regard. That tradition exists. But when we talk about rhetoric, we mostly mean the art of influencing through speech, and that's correct. Still, there are a few misunderstandings that have always been around, long before this so-called new focus on speaking. One of them is the idea that rhetoric is mainly about performance, looking around, using body language, keeping your head straight, standing upright, gesturing a lot or a little. People call that body language. But that's nonsense. There is no such thing as body language. If I may elaborate a bit, the body doesn't have a language. It has no grammar, no syntax. So if I tilt my head, that doesn't mean anything. And if I were to fold my arms, that wouldn't mean anything either. It's nonsense. But that's what people usually mean when they talk about rhetoric. That's the world I come from. I used to be a speech coach in the theater. Before that, I worked as a therapist, then moved into theater speech training, and gradually worked my way up. Later, I started working with journalists, so step by step, I moved closer to the content side of things. Journalists, of course, deal with content, but they don't create it themselves. They report on what others have to say. And I wanted to work with the people who actually have something to say in the true sense of the word. And in the end, I managed to do that. That can influence things a bit too. Less so for politicians, more for top executives. And for me, rhetoric is really an art of content. What do I say, and in what order? Do I structure it like a pyramid when I want to inform people? The most important thing first, then the details afterward. That's from Barbara Minto's pyramid principle, a great concept. Journalists use it when they write a press release. The most important part comes first. By the way, that pyramid idea actually comes from military communications. You'd send the key message first, because the telegraph line might go down right after. That's where this principle comes from. So anyone who's informing others, who has to speak quickly, needs to talk in a pyramid structure, if I can explain that briefly. When there's an earthquake, you start by saying, "This morning, at 4:30, there was an earthquake in Zurich." A lot of damage at Letten. Earthquakes are pretty rare in Zurich. Usually it's Italy that gets hit. And from there, you move on to less important details and background information. But if you want to convince someone to take part in an earthquake exercise, you have to turn the pyramid upside down. That's, of course, a bit odd for your kind of discussion. You need to bring back a sense of directness, of closeness. You have to connect with people, show that something really matters, and then in the end, get straight to the point. That's the structure of persuasion. I work on that with all my clients, over and over again. When do you need to inform? When do you need to persuade? How should you organize your content? And then there's a third point that often gets forgotten in all those cliches about rhetoric and body language. It's about role. What role is someone in? I always work with people who are in roles, people who, on behalf of a company, act as mercenaries for that company, so to speak. And they need to understand their role and know how to live it. In politics, there are a few examples of people who just didn't understand their role. Annalena Baerbock is one example we all got to witness. Someone who not only fails to fulfill their role, but doesn't even understand it. With our current chancellor, it's sometimes like that too. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. He kind of slips back and forth, hasn't quite figured out his role yet. I get asked about politicians' rhetoric from time to time, so that's why I'm just saying all this now. The former chancellor we had, if anyone still remembers him, Mr. Scholz, right? His name was Scholz. People always said he didn't speak well, that he was boring. But that too was a role. He was imitating Merkel. He was Merkeling, so to speak. He basically Merkeled away all the problems, everything, showing it all in this kind of foggy vagueness. And in terms of content, what Scholz did there was actually dangerous. I don't want to jump ahead to the second topic yet, but in his first speech, Scholz said, "People say society is divided." And his answer was, "Society is not divided," which means that the people who don't share his view aren't just forgotten. They're actually being ignored, personally ignored by the chancellor. He's basically saying, nope, they don't exist. They're just a few idiots off in the corner. But rhetoric is tough work. It's about taking on a role. It's about substance, and it has very little to do with what people call body language. Yeah.
Okay,
but what's really interesting about this whole podcast scene and everything around it is that there's now also a visual component, right? I mean, when I'm recording my podcast, I have to be careful not to suddenly look to the left if something happens, because that immediately gives away that something's going on, that my attention has shifted somewhere else. And that's not about language itself. It's about the way we can now actually see each other while we're talking, while we're watching. How should we think about that visual component?
That's really important, no question about it. What we're doing now, like when I think about whether I should smile, or if that would just be a forced smile, a so-called forced smile, or how I move my hand, or when I look away, when you look away, that all sends messages. What I'm saying is, it's hard to put that into any kind of grammar or syntax. That's nonsense. Sami Molcho did that. He's a very accomplished fellow citizen. He basically invented the whole topic of body language. But you can't just say, if you turn your head away, that means you're turning away from me on the inside. That's mostly nonsense. In some cases, it's downright absurd. There are very few real rules for that. That's why in my training sessions, when I work with my clients, I don't spend much time on that. There are two key things when it comes to the body. First, you need a strong core. That's why I'm standing right now. Are you standing? No, you're sitting. You're sitting. but at least you're sitting upright. You're still young. You can sit up straight. That's good. But I'm standing, because when you stand, you can control your body better. You can speak more clearly and with more precision. And second, your gestures need to be free. That's what I'm doing. My hands are free, so I can express myself better. That's really all there is to it, at least from my perspective as a speech coach who gives advice for a living.
Als Redelehrer, der für Geld Ratschläge gibt.
Beim Schreiben, das Interessante beim Schreiben ist ja, dass wir uns die Formulierungen
When we write, what's interesting about writing is that we can think about our wording, change it, refine it, and that's part of what makes it so enjoyable. Writing is a form of thinking, but speaking is also a form of thinking. And that whole process of stumbling over words, going back, rephrasing, using our hands, our gestures, using our whole body, really, to express ourselves together. To what extent do you feel that this also affects how communication actually happens? That we don't just communicate through writing and try to persuade that way, but also through the way we, as podcasters for example, try to create a sense of closeness, to build trust, and to take our listeners along on our own journey. How do you see that?
Auf die eigene Reise. Wie bewerten Sie das?
Ja, das ist eigentlich dieselbe Antwort.
Yeah, that's basically the same answer I'd give again. It's all really important. You always have to find a balance between authenticity and the roles you play. You, Mr. Lataz, you have your own authenticity. You're a person with certain characteristics. That's where you're authentic. But you also have roles. You say, okay, I'm doing a podcast interview for an hour, so I need to behave appropriately, be reasonably well-dressed, freshly shaved, or whatever it might be. And in that moment, you're moving within a role. And that does matter. It means you're not entirely authentic anymore. It's not just Pascal talking to me, it's Pascal Lataz in his role.
Pascal, der mit mir redet, sondern Pascal Lataz in seiner Rolle. Sie reden nicht mit Stefan, ich bin privat.
You're not talking to Stefan. In private, I'm actually pretty chaotic. But right now, I'm behaving myself. I've shaved properly, even my head, and I'm trying to say what I want to say as clearly and effectively as I can, and in a good enough mood that people enjoy watching, that it really comes across. And of course, that works much better when I'm speaking. I've got a lot more options that way. In writing, I only have the words. I polish the words and hope that someone understands them or likes that way of writing. By the way, I've often heard that about several of my books, sometimes as praise, sometimes as criticism.
Manchmal positiv, manchmal negativ, manchmal steht es auch in den Kommentaren bei
Sometimes you even see it in the comments on Amazon, in the reviews. This is written in a very spoken style. And that's true. In one of my books, I actually wrote in the preface that I built it out of lectures. I transcribed those talks and then turned them into a book. You can tell it's written in a spoken way. I take that as a compliment. I like that. I enjoy doing it. I think writing in a more spoken style, or, to put it another way, making written language sound more like speech, brings us right back to the topic of language itself. Written language is becoming more conversational, and I believe that can definitely make written texts more effective. Just look at Der Spiegel.
Sein kann für Schrifttexte. Schauen Sie den Spiegel an. Der Spiegel hat ja vor Jahrzehnten schon irgendwie.
Decades ago, Der Spiegel was already writing better than many others. The Spiegel writers were better because, in part, they wrote in a more spoken style. The article started like this. Well, that's what he gets. Peter Kay is angry. His wife is gone, after 20 years. And that's how the piece began. Which brings us right to the next point. That article wasn't written in formal written German, at least not at the beginning. It was written in a more spoken way, and that makes a huge difference. In the kind of brainwashing I do, what I call executive mode, when I help managers move out of that German bean-counting, over-explaining mindset and into a mode that actually has impact, one key step is move from written to spoken.
Ein Punkt von schriftlich zu mündlich. Und ich habe lange darüber nachgedacht und habe
I've thought about this for a long time, and I realize that the unit of measure for written language is the text. The unit of measure for spoken language is the saying. And we're living in a time of sayings now. Back then, it was really important to be able to write a good essay, using the subjunctive, semicolons, all that stuff, infinitives with to. Today, what matters is having a good line ready when someone sticks a microphone in your face. That's the big difference. When I was a teenager, my father used to tell me, "You'll never make money with sayings." But he was wrong.
Kein Geld verdienen. Aber er hat sich geirrt. Hat in Sprüchen jetzt sehr viel Geld verdient.
I've made a lot of money with slogans. I come up with slogans together with my clients, and I don't write texts, I invent slogans. Because in the end, when they stand there and speak, they have to speak in slogans. That's a bit pointed, a bit exaggerated, and hopefully a little entertaining too. But really, it's a huge shift, moving from written to spoken language, again, part of this new orality that's been growing and evolving for at least 10 years now. And if I may add, my home turf is, of course, business communication, executive communication.
Executive Communication. Und da habe ich es oft mit Redenschreibern zu tun.
I often work with speechwriters, or of course with the people who actually give the speeches, and they'll say, "My speechwriters wrote the text for me, I'll send it over." So I get it in advance, and I can already see that yes, things have gotten much better over time, but still, very often it's written in formal German. It starts with something like, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to warmly welcome you, also, on behalf of..." Our companies have been undergoing profound change for years, facing strategic challenges. That kind of industrial lyricism, this poetic corporate language that speechwriters use, both in speeches and in answers. And that industrial lyricism needs to be broken down, turned into real, spoken phrases. That's part of my job, turning written texts into speech that actually sounds like something people would say.
Aus Texten Sprüche machen.
Es ist schon spannend. Es ist faszinierend, auch wie es.
It's really interesting, actually fascinating, how it all works. How important is that whole topic people sometimes dismiss as, what's the term I'm looking for? Not attention grabbing, not that, but when you exaggerate titles to.
Soundbites, ja. Was Sie meinen,
What you probably mean is that you have to come up with some really punchy lines.
Ja, so
Yes, there's a specific word for that, but it's slipped my mind right now. When you phrase a title in a way that's just way too sensational, what's that word again?
Was ist das Wort?
Ja, also ich nenne Soundbites.
I call it soundbites, a slogan, a claim, something short and sharp, when it's really pointed, really striking, not dull, when it gets straight to the point, very compact, almost like a claim. Book titles. I love coming up with book titles. I have a book series, Executive Modest Press, maybe together with Herder, and we work with authors to develop books, business books. And I really enjoy creating the titles, the subtitles. Maybe you'll think of one later, I'm very curious. I call it a soundbite. And why? I've been twice to see the coach who worked with Clinton, Obama, and Biden, Joe Michael Sheehan in Washington.
Bei Michael Sheehan in Washington. Einmal haben wir einen Klienten aus Frankfurt dahin gebracht vor.
Once, many years ago, a colleague and I took a client from Frankfurt over there. Later, I went back again to learn a bit from those people, the speech coaches for the Democrats, and they asked, "What's his line?" We had just walked in the door, and they said, "What's your guy's line? What's his message?" And we said, "A line?" Well, the company had a really good, very expensive text written for him. And Michael Sheehan and his team said, if he doesn't have a line, he might as well stay home. So, what's his line? They call those sound bites. And that's the kind of practical knowledge I work with. What I do, and this brings us almost back to AI, or maybe the opposite of AI, is that I develop, together with my clients, sound bites, catchy lines, good phrases in a kind of creative process. They'll say, "Perfect, we'll take that. That's where we'll start. That one fits. That metaphor works." It's really a kind of creative work that comes from classical rhetoric. You find it in written rhetoric too. The tropes, the imagery, all of that. But in the end, it's about coming up with good, memorable lines.
Aber es sind letztlich gute Sprüche, die erfunden werden.
Jetzt ist mir wieder in den Sinn gekommen, ich meinte Clickbaiting.
It just came back to me. I was talking about clickbaiting, about creating clickbaits, which is basically what that is, though usually in written form. And the point for me as an academic is that academics tend to have this expectation of using a more elevated way of communicating. I mean, just read Immanuel Kant. It's terrible. 2-page-long sentences, all tangled up. He either didn't want to be understood, or he really thought that way. And now we're moving in the opposite direction. As a podcaster, I not only have to think about what's being said, what we're discussing during that hour on the podcast, but also how to sell it, how to make people actually start listening. And that creates this kind of paradox. We have to sell something complex in a short sentence that also has to sound sensational. That doesn't exactly build trust, but it works.
It's about persuasion, sharp, focused persuasion. In a short social media post, a bit of clickbait, or maybe the opening line of a speech. Or it's that clip you pull from a podcast where you say, that's the one I'll put right at the top. The boldest line, the soundbite, the compressed statement that sums everything up. Now, whether that line, like you said, can really hold up scientifically, or whether it reflects the whole world, of course not. So we've got these two worlds. On one side, the experts, what I like to call expert mode, the scientist mode, the explainer mode. And in that world, something like this just doesn't work. That's exactly how it works. People, when they're in the wrong mode, by the way, tend to answer like they're in an oral exam. If I were to ask you right now, so what has Pascal Lotaz remembered about this topic? That's the kind of response you'd get. But anyone who wants to have an impact switches into what I'd call an impact mode. That means shifting from written to spoken, and in some ways from being authentic to taking on a role. And that's what gets the message across. Then, of course, there are always people who come along afterward. Academic colleagues, you must experience this all the time, who say, that's not academic enough. That's not academic at all. And you'll probably just say, well, fine, I'm not trying to be academic, I'm making a podcast.
What's interesting here is that the podcast world kind of builds its own filter. The people who agree with a statement, they click on it, they listen, and they're usually quite receptive to the whole thing. And those who don't want any of that, they don't even get that far. Which means they never really reach the point of criticism, of engaging with the actual content. That's fascinating, this bubble formation that happens even within spoken formats, as it develops through the internet and social media.
Really interesting, this whole bubble phenomenon. Everyone complains about it. Everyone says we live in bubbles, and that's true. I feel it in myself too, and of course, that's dangerous, no question about it. But now if we move to the more practical side, where maybe we can offer a bit of advice for your viewers or listeners, this brings us back to the idea of the pyramid and the funnel. At the beginning, you put out a teaser, a soundbite, a catchy line, something that provokes. And naturally, that kind of thing also contributes to division. That's obvious. It inevitably adds to polarization, because people either agree or they don't. That's why half of them are already gone. The half that thinks it's completely stupid, totally off, mean, inhumane, whatever you want to call it, those people will tune out. That's the downside of the pyramid. I actually wrote a whole book about that, called Pyramid and Funnel. So yes, that's the problem with the pyramid. You start with something sharp at the top, and later you go deeper. That's how academic work functions too. At the top, you have the thesis. We've both been through writing a dissertation, and then you unfold the whole thing. That's what's called the judgment style. Lawyers call it the judgment style. The verdict is delivered. The defendant is not guilty.
Der Angeklagte ist nicht schuldig. Es ist nicht sicher, dann kommt die Erklärung, ob überhaupt da war.
It's not certain. Then comes the explanation, whether he was even there, whether he even had an axe, whether he even had a wife, and so on. None of it could be proven. Then comes the explanation. But the expert report, of course, has to take a different approach. It has to make a convincing case. Whether in writing or spoken, that doesn't matter right now. The report has to persuade. It says, this is how it was, this is how it happened, we did this, we compared that, it seems to be this way. It could be that way. And in the end, we're of the opinion that he wasn't the one.
Sind wir der Meinung, ist es nicht gewesen. Und genauso ist mein irres Beispiel, bitte nochmal Vergebung.
And it's the same with my crazy example about forgiveness and the earthquake. The information about an earthquake, or trying to motivate someone to take part in something related to an earthquake, those are two completely different things. And of course, you want both. You want the person you're talking to, right now, that's me, to be convinced. I want to be convincing. I want someone to say, that's interesting, that's good, maybe I'll buy that book. You want both, to be persuasive in what you're saying, but also to inform. You're saying, okay, let me show what's out there.
Sie sagen, okay, zeig mal, was es alles so gibt.
Und auch auseinandernehmen und verstehen, oder? Weil diese Möglichkeit.
And also to take things apart and understand them, because this kind of spoken exchange really helps us approach complex topics much faster and much better than we can in writing. Books and essays just take a lot longer. Here, we can talk about things directly. And maybe that's actually a good transition to the second part, to what's happening in politics right now, how it works in spoken form, or maybe doesn't work and becomes dysfunctional. If we look at how propaganda is blaring from television screens across Europe, we can see how large parts of society are being drawn into a kind of war policy mindset. So do you have any observations or analyses you'd like to share on that?
Ein paar Beobachtungen oder Analysen, die Sie gerne teilen möchten.
Klar, es gibt, erst muss man sagen,
Sure. First of all, we have to say this is a very old phenomenon. It's been around for thousands of years. There's a gradual path between persuading, which is what we want, morally and ethically, and manipulating. There's something like a rhetorical ethics. In ancient times, a rhetorician wasn't just someone who spoke beautifully. A rhetorician was considered a good person, a morally good person, who also knew how to speak well. And that person could persuade others. That was the ideal in antiquity. Because someone was credible and decent, people believed them more than others. That's persuasion. Then there's a second form, which we might call convincing by pressure, or just talking someone into something. Think of the vacuum cleaner salesman, someone who really wants to close the deal. Or the sales pro. On LinkedIn, I keep getting offers, probably you do too. Offers about how to get your people to click even more.
Wie man noch mehr Klicks kriegt. Ja. Sie schauen schon gar nicht mehr hin, ich schaue jedes 10. Mal hin.
They don't even look anymore. I only look maybe 1 out of 10 times when I get something like that. That would be the second level, persuasion. The third one is manipulation. That means it's no longer about behavior, the kind of engagement we should have in a democracy, thankfully. Instead, reason gets short-circuited. Content gets banned, content gets filtered out, so that in the end you only believe one thing. That's manipulation. That's what I grew up in East Germany. You can probably guess. That's what they used to call agitation back then. The word's gone a bit out of fashion, but I use it again in my book to show it as the opposite of argumentation. There's argumentation and there's agitation. But again, convincing, persuading, manipulating, and in the end, propaganda.
Und dann, am Ende, ist Propaganda. Propaganda lässt gar nichts mehr zu, schließt ständig kurz.
Propaganda doesn't allow for anything anymore. It keeps short-circuiting, always driving toward that one single point, only that one, and it no longer asks for conviction. It just says, this is what must be done. We must, that's what we keep hearing. We must. Europe must. It's a rhetoric of imperatives. The imperative has become the central mode. We can talk about a few trends. I've noticed some in this new way of thinking, and not all of them are very encouraging. Sure, let's do that. What are these trends? One trend, and maybe the most dangerous one, is the shift from the discussion circle to the language of combat. In Switzerland, we probably had even more of that, though I don't know Switzerland all that well. But it used to be that no one in the discussion circle was supposed to be startled.
Niemand durfte erschreckt werden, ja, im Stuhlkreis. Wenn man Feedback gibt, muss man etwas Positives sagen.
When you give feedback, you're supposed to say something positive first. Then you're not supposed to push anyone too hard, not touch them, not get too close. We've been living in that kind of culture for decades now, and that's actually one of the reasons why, well, why freedom of speech has been eroding. People can hardly stand it anymore when someone has a different opinion. We don't even want to influence each other anymore. We grew up in this kind of circle time rhetoric where everyone just says nice things, only wonderful things. But that's changing now. Of course it has to change. We're facing some very tough realities, disease and war. And while those are two very different things, they have the same effect. They radicalize the way we speak.
Die radikalisieren Rhetorik. Und jetzt geht's von Stuhlkreis zu Kampfmetapher.
And now we're moving from the circle of chairs to the language of battle. It's all about fighting these days. Fighting for, fighting against anti-Semitism, fighting for this, fighting for democracy. Fight, 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 fight. And that, Mr. Lataz, I remember from East Germany. Toward the end of the GDR, that battle metaphor really went off the rails. The fight rose up one more time, and then not long after, it was all over. That's a phenomenon, one of the trends we can see. A second trend, if we just keep going, moves from complication. Germans have always been good at complicating things, to simplification and infantilization. Actually, that's not all bad, because as I say in my brainwashing sessions, you mustn't speak in a complicated way. I tell my clients, you have to speak more simply. That's all wonderful, all nice, but you can take it too far. And when you listen to a speech by the federal president, the way he talks, you think, this sounds like something out of a fairy tale. Everything's fine, we're here, and out there is the big bad wolf. But we here, we're doing things where, well, we're kind of caught up in this infantilization, the way millions of people are being infantilized by very, very simplified messages, like, don't go on the internet, don't even open a history book. Really, everything's already been chewed up for you. Everything's already clear. And that, Mr. Lataz, I know from the GDR. When the wall came down, we all thought the best of both sides would come together. But in the end, it seems the worst of both sides came together.
That trend is also part of it. It's actually one of the main arguments of the people who came up with this whole idea of fact checkers. They say, we're going to fact check now, we'll figure out the facts, and then we'll give them to the public. And the public has to accept that, because the experts have already settled it. It's clear now, and all that's left is to explain it. That means, if people have a different opinion, then they just weren't properly instructed. They didn't understand it. They're seen as a bit too dumb, so it just needs to be explained to them again, a little more simply.
Muss man es ein bisschen einfacher erklären. So eben, warum ist es wichtig, dass man jetzt
Why is it that people say you have to get the vaccine now, and then explain it as if they were talking to a little child? If someone disagrees, that person is either too stupid, or, especially when it comes to the second topic, the war, they're evil. They want evil. They want to help Putin. They want to help Xi. They want to infiltrate us, to undermine us. And that's where the warlike rhetoric comes in. So, how is it that people automatically start thinking in those two categories and then build their entire worldview around them, shaping all their thoughts within that framework?
I've thought about that for a long time, of course, because of that perspective. First, people from the East like me. My friend Jan-Josef Liefers, for example, we recently did an event together. Back then I had already left, I had already escaped, but he was still in the GDR. And even as a young man, he stood up against that nonsense. I think people from the East have a pretty good sense for when something's off, just like you described. They can spot propaganda from miles away. When the TV says, just trust the government, they go, oh, I know that one. Let me take a look at what else is out there. And the West Germans, who for decades, well, I fled to this Western democracy at the risk of my life because I wanted to, because I'm a passionate Democrat. Those people are defenseless in a way. For decades, their only experience has been, we're the good ones. Somewhere out there, there's a war, something bad is happening, there are some bad guys, but of course, not us. So when you live in that kind of mindset, where everyone just swallows whatever comes from television, that's exactly what happens.
Es ist auch die Westdeutschen und der Westen
Well, the
generell.
West Germans, and the West in general, including Switzerland, don't really have any living memory of losing a major war. And in that sense, the GDR, meaning East Germany, it wasn't really a reunification. It was more like an absorption. Basically, the East was dissolved. On the other hand, countries like Poland and Hungary were also part of the Eastern Bloc. I don't follow it closely enough. I don't know it well enough. So, do we actually see more criticism in those societies toward the kind of propaganda we're seeing right now? Or not?
Der Gesellschaft gegenüber der Propaganda, die wir im Moment wahrnehmen, oder nicht?
Ich denke, dass soweit ich die
From what I've seen, traveling through the Eastern countries back when the wall was still up, and I'll be in Bulgaria in 2 weeks, really curious to see how things have developed there. I think we're seeing similar patterns. There's this tendency not to just swallow everything that comes out of Brussels. That's something you find more often in the eastern states. It worked that way for decades, but now the eastern countries are starting to say, we're not just going to accept things as they are. We don't want to be pushed into some black and white mindset or a kind of moralism. And that probably has to do with people's experience. There are just many who say, I want to check that for myself. If something comes from an official source, I want to look into it first.
Von offizieller Stelle entgegenkommt. Das will ich prüfen. Jetzt haben wir eine Demokratie, das ist auch gut so.
Now we have a democracy, and that's a good thing. We hold elections every 4 years. We have a government, and I can say openly, I voted for this government too. So I'm definitely not someone who wants things to move further to the right. Absolutely not. But we elected this government, and now suddenly it's starting to do things. The previous government already did, actually. Nancy Faeser and this Altenwang, they were quite the duo. And what they did back then, they already started changing the first laws, the first regulations. They introduced that law on delegitimization. And now, the current government can use it too. And in their coalition agreement, on page 23 to be exact, they've already written that they want to punish people if they say something wrong.
Bestrafen will, wenn jemand etwas Falsches sagt. Das hat Herr Luthers, das hat es noch nicht mal in der DDR.
That never even happened in East Germany, that the government decided what's right and what's wrong. According to Article 5 of our basic law, it's supposed to be free citizens, in open discussion, along with journalists, experts, and scientists. But now the government wants to decide what's right and what's wrong. They've backed off from that a bit. Thankfully, they've got a few other problems now. But they already wrote a coalition agreement. Not even East Germany did that. The GDR came up with a trick, a philosophical, or rather pseudo-philosophical trick, claiming there were objective and subjective behaviors. So if someone had the wrong opinion, like I did, well, I spent half a year in prison for 43 sentences I said when I was 20 years old. If someone had the wrong opinion, then, well, objectively, there's the truth. You just don't have it, as they would put it. You just haven't recognized it yet. You need to have it explained to you again. But actually, that can't really be the case, right? That's somehow subjective. And if you don't let go of your strange, subjective opinion, then we'll have to give you a little push. In the worst case, you'll have to be locked away. And that's the trend in all authoritarian regimes. All of them. Every totalitarian regime. What does totalitarian even mean? Maybe this. Total means either or. Either you're with us or you're against us. And those are developments I don't want to see. It hurts me. I'm a Democrat. I fled to democracy at the risk of my life. I don't ever want to experience something like that again.
Ich möchte sowas nicht nochmal erleben.
Ich führe ja auch Gespräche mit Psychologen.
I also talk with psychologists and with people who deal with this professionally. Propaganda researchers, for example. I have conversations with them, and they try to explain these mechanisms. And we can explain them, we can understand them, we can break them down on different levels. There's the long historical view, the 1,000 years of the Crusades, that sheds light on what's happening right now in Gaza, on the genocide. Then there's colonialism, which sheds light on it, and the lobby, which sheds light on it, and finally, the political transformation.
Verhandlungen so und politisch, man muss so viele Ebenen auseinandernehmen, aber die Ebene
There are
der
so many
Sprache,
layers to
deswegen habe
unpack.
ich mich eigentlich
But the layer of language, I've actually never really talked about that before. That's why I'm so interested in this conversation about rhetoric. Is there a way we could somehow talk our way out of this precarious situation we're already in? Politically, psychologically, and even mass psychologically. Are you trying to use language as a way to get us out of it?
Die Sprache zu verwenden, da rauszukommen.
Ja klar, das ist das, worüber ich nachdenke. Das sind so auf den letzten Seiten die Ideen, welche Möglichkeiten es gibt. Also eine Möglichkeit ist bestehen auf dem Artikel, weil in der Schweiz weiß ich nicht, wie der heißt, aber in Deutschland ist der Artikel 5 des Grundgesetzes, darauf bestehen, darauf beharren, dass der bestehen bleibt, dass der nicht abgebaut wird, dass der nicht als Einfallstor für irgendwas gesehen wird, sondern auf der Verfassung bestehen. Das ist das Erste. Also ich bin
I'm what you'd call a friend of the Constitution. And the second thing is, have courage. Have the courage to speak your mind.
Seine Meinung zu sagen.
Mut haben zu reden. Also Mut haben, die Sprache.
Have the courage to speak. Have the courage to talk. Have the courage to speak up. Of course, there are lots of initiatives for dialogue, for talking with each other, but they often fall apart, especially once they're funded by the state. Then they quickly turn into this kind of fact-checking exercise. That means you get people saying, if he doesn't understand it, we just need to explain it to him again so he'll get back on the right path. But the real opportunity we have is to stand firm on Article 5 and to speak our minds. And that's interesting. I don't draw boundaries.
Und das Interessante ist ja, schon viele Leute vor uns, die ja eben...
There were many people before us who were responsible for the fact that we have good constitutions in Germany, in Switzerland, and in the United States. I have to say I often criticize the US, but the American Constitution itself is a remarkable document. And the way Americans insist on it, especially on freedom of speech, that really matters. What's interesting about freedom of speech is that it's exactly that, the freedom to speak. There's nothing in it that says you have to speak the truth, or what's right, or what's good. It's simply the freedom of language, the idea that whatever can be said, may be said.
Das, was immer gesagt werden kann, auch gesagt werden darf.
Ich darf mich auf den Marktplatz stellen und darf sagen,
I can stand in the town square and say, I want my old Kaiser Wilhelm back. That's crazy. Most of us would see that as crazy, but it's allowed. I can stand there and say it. I'd say, in God's name, let someone stand there and say it. I can stand in the square and say, I believe in UFOs. That's all fine. What someone can't do and shouldn't do is sing the Horst Wessel song. And that's right. That's how it has to be. But apart from that, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, Article 5, is absolute.
Artikel 5, absolut. Das Bundesverfassungsgericht hat mehrfach gesagt, man darf
The Federal Constitutional Court has said it many times. You're allowed to say things that are constitutional or not, true or false. Really, that's what the court has ruled. You're allowed to say all of it. And if we start saying, this can't be said here, or that can't be said there, that's the beginning of the end. Then we're no different from the so-called autocrats. We're not a bit better than they are. Maybe one more thing. Toward the end of my book, I tried to bring in a bit of humor again. I think the supreme discipline of Western rhetoric in the 21st century could be called speaking under extreme observation.
heißen könnte, reden unter extremer Beobachtung. Also früher galt das nur für Politiker, dann natürlich zusehen.
So in the past, that only applied to politicians. Then, of course, increasingly, with companies going public, it started to apply to top executives too. But now it basically applies to everyone, to a podcaster, to anyone who says anything at all. You have to weigh it immediately. The risk of speaking is weighed like the risk of a bungee jump. Can I say this? Can I not? Am I allowed to say that? And then there's this, it's also something we knew from East Germany, this constant need to throw in reminders that you're on the right side, that you're for the good cause. You always have to make these declarations. This obligation to declare your stance, that's where the undemocratic part of democracy shows up. I constantly have to say, I'm for this, against that, condemn this, and support that.
Dafür bin, Ganz furchtbar. Und das ist die Königsdisziplin der Rhetorik.
Absolutely dreadful. And that's really the ultimate discipline in rhetoric, speaking under extreme scrutiny. If I were to offer a workshop on that tomorrow, say on LinkedIn or somewhere, speaking under extreme scrutiny, it could fill a town hall, or maybe a catacomb, depending on the crowd. And then I start thinking, if I were to run such a workshop for 2 days, just to make it a bit more interesting, speaking under extreme scrutiny, I might hire a Vipassana guru for one afternoon, a silence coach. It might even be that silence coaches are more expensive these days than speech coaches, and that's one I couldn't afford.
Und den würde ich mir dann nicht leisten. Ja.
Yes, that's true. That's the other side of it, of course. Sometimes talking is silver and silence is gold. Knowing when not to say something is an art in itself.
I work all the time with people who have to act in roles almost like puppets, and through what they say, they can either create value or destroy it. So of course that's extremely important. But when that starts to matter for ordinary people on the street, when they start wondering, what can I say, what can't I say yet, then it gets kind of strange. And that's really the paradox of this new kind of orality. People talk more and more, but there's less and less that's actually being said. And that gap might keep getting wider and wider. We can only stop it with those few ideas we talked about, through language, through how we use language, through explanation and clarification, mixed with kindness, mixed with a sense of closeness, without provoking too much. I try to do that too, even though it's not easy for me. Those are the only options we have. But one thing's clear, we can talk about a forecast. The new tendency for people to talk more and more, that can't be stopped. It'll probably just keep going. That's something lasting. But if the other trend turns out to be just as lasting, then we'd all better brace ourselves.
Dann können wir uns alle warm anziehen.
Nein, das sollte es eben nicht sein. Also
No, that's exactly what it shouldn't be. A good society would be one where people can speak freely, and where that's truly possible, but also one where listening is free, and we don't have to feel like we're being watched all the time. In other words, not a surveillance state.
Der Überwachungsstaat.
Da kann ich noch mal mit Brecht kommen. Brecht hatte
Let me bring up Brecht again. Brecht had this line in a poem. It comes before a song, and it says something like, "He would like to be good, but the circumstances don't allow it." What that means is, under the hard facts we're facing, our society is working its way into a kind of war mode. And when that happens, the rhetoric shifts, from a circle of chairs to battle metaphors. But war and democracy don't go together. They just don't. They don't fit. And one last thing, I remember that from the GDR. It was always in combat mode. There was the class enemy, there was the military, right there at the border, at the wall. The enemy was literally standing there, and people lived in a constant state of confrontation. I was so relieved to get away from that, and I really don't want to see it start all over again.
Und ich möchte nicht, dass das wieder beginnt.
Es ist eine Hoffnung, die ich teile und eine Hoffnung, auf der wir auch.
It's a hope I share, and a hope we can build on. And I really hope we can talk our way out of this mess together. I also don't agree that we in Europe should just go into this war. No, we're not doing that. And now we'll have to convince the others that we shouldn't do it again. I'm including the Swiss in that. We all have to try together to get out of this war and not repeat the same mistake. Mr. Wachtel, for those who'd like to read your book, it was just shown behind you. It's available too.
Das ist sehr schön illustriert. Darf ich kurz sagen, das ist ein noch besseres Product Placement als mein.
That's an even better product placement than my new mug, which you can now buy. I think I need to set up, 10 of those things? But the book, you can get that from Herber Publishing, right? Yes, everywhere. Everywhere. And the other books too. So you can also find them under Dr. Stefan Wachtel at stefan-wachtel.da. That's where people can find your training programs and so on. I can really recommend it. You've built a great website too. Is there anywhere else people should go to find you or your...
Ein Ort, an den die Leute hingehen sollen, um sie zu finden oder ihre Veröffentlichungen?
Eher nicht. Ich unterscheide mich von
Not really.
einer von diesen
I'm one of the
wenigen
few people in the
Leuten,
German-speaking
die,
world who actually does one-on-one executive coaching.
Executive Coaching machen. Ich
I
habe
don't
nichts
deal
damit
with
zu
large
tun,
groups. I don't run public seminars either.
Ich mache nur
Once a
einmal
year,
einen
I hold a
Leser-
train-the-trainer workshop in Nice for 3, maybe 4 or 5 people. Younger trainers I teach my 2 methods to, and how to keep their clients in check. That's the kind of work I do. But usually, it's only by recommendation, and always with individual clients or a few top executives. Sometimes with politicians, though that's less common.
Politiker eher seltener.
Okay, aber dann die Bücher sind.
Okay, but then, the books are where people can also find your research and your insights. For anyone who's interested, please take a look. I'll try to include the links in the description as well. Hopefully I won't forget. Dr. Stefan Wachtel, thank you very much for your time today.
Herr Dr. Stefan Wachtel, vielen Dank für Ihre Zeit heute.
Danke, Pascal.
Thank you, Dr. Pascal Lotas. Thank you. Thanks, bye.
Danke, ciao.